Damon Hill is one of Formula One's greatest British product. The 1996 World Champion took to the High Performance podcast by Jake Humphries, and there were 10 things that I learned in this episode. Welcome to my F1 channel, welcome to Peter on Pole. My name is Peter in pole position, and if you love Formula One content like this where we review and react to certain interviews and certain debates, then make sure you subscribe to the channel and smash a like on the video if you love people like Damon Hill. It was very random that this interview seemed to come to place, but then I was reminded of the fact that Damon Hill has got a movie coming out, which absolutely we're going to watch and make sure we will do a review, so comment down below if you want to see the review of that. But as this film has now come out, he's been doing a big press run at the moment, and on the Jake Humphries podcast, I thought let me have a listen and dive deep, because this was about an hour and 30 minutes long, and I wondered what on earth could Damon Hill be talking about for an hour and a half that we probably don't already know. But some of the first things we dived straight into was the fact that his dad died when he was 15 years of age. Not that this was new information, but these were some of the things that he touched upon, and very early in the interview as well. The question asked to him is, would his dad have approved had he stayed alive of Damon Hill becoming a Formula One driver himself? The reason I bring up the dad is purely because Graham Hill, of course, was also a Formula One world champion. Two-time, in fact. 14 wins and 36 podiums. Graham Hill is definitely a legend and an icon of the Formula One sport. But apparently in interviews, Graham had said that, you know what, he's too intelligent to become a Formula One driver. There's no way he would do so, because of the risks and everything. And bear in mind, you know, in the 60s, Formula One in the 60s compared to Formula One in the late 90s is a completely different thing. And it's even more different now. But Damon goes on to say that when he won that title in 1996, his dad did pop up in his memory. And of course, you can imagine the amount of emotion that might have been there, where he would have thought, you know what, if his dad was around and if he got to see him become world champion, that would have been obviously an emotional scene. It would have been a great moment. Sort of think back to Jenson Button and his dad, who has now unfortunately passed away. But, you know, Jenson Button's dad at least saw Jenson win a title. But I thought it was very important to ask the question, like, would his dad have approved? Now, sometimes you might think if you were big in a particular area that you might actually want your son or you want your children to follow in the same footsteps. But it turns out that Graham thought, no. As far as my son's concerned, I don't think he would get into Formula One. But Damon had so many opportunities, and of course, the fact that he was half decent at least to be a Formula One driver, he ended up loving the sport and of course became world champion in 1996. Second thing I then noticed, they go deeper into the whole situation regarding Graham Hill, who had passed away, and how he passed away and the impact and effect that it had on the family. And Damon even goes on to say, like, it's still a powerful moment for him even now. Now bear this in mind, Damon Hill lost his dad at 15 years of age, and at the age of 64, when this interview was done, he still said it had a big impact on his life. And it's still a very powerful moment. But the bizarre thing is how he heard about the loss of his dad. The way that Damon and the family found out about the passing of his father was journalists calling up the house, and journalists thinking that Damon's mother already knew what had happened. They were asking questions as if she would have already known, and she was very much like, what are we talking about here? What's going on? And Damon described it as a nasty shock to the family. And he makes the point that Graham had actually just retired as a Formula One driver after being one for 17 years. And then 5 months later, after he retires, he passes away in what was a horrific plane crash. Back then, Graham Hill had his own Formula One team as well, but unfortunately that team had to fold. Now Graham was able to sort of fly his own plane, and he had a license, and apparently the license had run out, whereby he could fly like under foggy conditions, a bit wet conditions and stuff like that. And you know, you can imagine the stories in the newspapers and the media back then, how much intensity there was on top of the family there to try and find out exactly how someone has died. Meanwhile, you've got a whole family there mourning the loss of the father, the husband, and it's just, yeah, it's unbelievable what the Hill family must have gone through in that time. The question then comes up again, you know, had your dad survived, would you have been a Formula One driver yourself? And Damon loves to give this sort of statement where he doesn't want to give anybody the satisfaction of giving an answer. He didn't want to satisfy people who asked. He wanted to sort of leave that as a bit of a question that can never be answered and leave people questioning and leave them in limbo. Which leads me to the third point, that Damon Hill was a big motorcycle sports fan. He loved racing at a very young age, and he doesn't really know whether he would have gone into more of the car sort of situation or would have stayed on the bikes. And check this, he didn't start karting until he was about 22, 23 years of age. That is crazy late for being anyone of a Formula One driver. And the presenters as well were shocked. Jake couldn't believe it. He's like, he started that late? And bear in mind, his Formula One debut was at 32 years of age. You couldn't even dream or fathom or think about that right now. Lewis Hamilton is touching 40 right now. Could you imagine saying that 8-10 years ago Hamilton has made his debut in Formula One? It sounds ridiculous. We've got drivers like Kimi Antonelli, we've got Isaac Hadjar, we've got Jack Doohan, Oliver Bearman, people that are crazy young. And remember, Verstappen was driving at 17 in Formula One. But the interesting fact here as well, debuting at 32, Graham Hill also debuted at the same age. The fourth thing that we learn is that Damon Hill became a test driver at Williams, and you know who the two drivers were at the time at Williams? It was Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell. I think Nigel Mansell took it badly when they recruited Alain Prost, because Alain Prost was a serious driver, and in Formula 1 it gets political about number 1 drivers, number 2 drivers. Nigel Mansell all of a sudden pulls out. And so what do they do with the second seat at Williams? Where do they go? Who do they give it to? And so Damon, being the test driver, they gave him the opportunity to fly out to Portugal, to Estoril, and to do the test. The irony is, from Fulham, where he was living at the time, he flew out through Heathrow to go to Portugal, and he flew out on the same day, on the anniversary of his father's death. And he talked about the rushing and having to get up there, you know, having to rush through Chelsea. I think Chelsea Football Club were playing at home on that same day. He couldn't get to the airport quick enough. He managed to fly out, he'd done the test, and then he could sort of sit back and just wait to see what the results would be. But happy to know he got the gig afterwards, and it was what you would call a moment in his life, which was such a big thing for him. And he talked about, you know, perseverance. He talked about, you know, how these moments can really change your lives, can really do things. And he thought an opportunity that had come and gone, and, you know, he was sort of panicking and everything like that. You know, he's flying a plane on the anniversary of his dad's death, and he's thinking all sorts of things, but he manages to go there. He succeeds, and he becomes Williams' driver alongside Alain Prost. The fifth thing that we learn is about Sir Frank Williams and the kind of role model that he was to Damon Hill. Hill mentioned that, you know, Frank made it a very soft landing for him at Williams, although Frank was one of those guys who was very hard, very hardcore, and wanted to do anything to win. But he had hope in the fact that he was a British driver, obviously Sir Frank Williams as well, former British driver as well. And he said, as a driver, you know, on one hand you had Sir Frank Williams being that kind of soft landing, kind of being that sort of advisor and mentor and everything like that, whereas Alain Prost gave nothing away. The man was proper competitive. Prost was somebody who did not give anything to anybody, even if he was a rookie in the same team. Damon Hill uses words like he was a poker player even against a rookie. At the time as well, Williams had a French engine, which was Renault, and then they had a French driver, Alain Prost. So it was kind of a bit of a battle between the two. You know, you had the British man, you had the English driver in there, but you also had the French driver as well as the French engine. It was quite amazing to see. But Damon was under no illusions that he was clearly the number 2 driver, because he was up against a 3-time Formula 1 world champion. The sixth thing that we learned in this interview is that Damon Hill struggled with trying to adapt from being lucky to be in Formula 1 to actually earning the right to be there. He felt like he was constantly trying to prove himself, and he just didn't feel like he got over the hurdle. I mean, he wasn't necessarily a particularly phenomenal driver in Formula 1, and he was nowhere near the levels of his dad. And of course, you know, when he was younger and everybody knew about his dad was incredibly famous. Every time he kept being compared to his dad, and even the people that loved him and knew him or got to know him, he always had that cynic mind of like, you know, people only know me because of my dad. So it was almost like him trying to become like Damon Hill all on his own, rather than, you know, Damon Hill, son of Graham. But he was saying, you know, the 94 season, the 95 season, he was really in a bit of a hard sort of mental battle in terms of feeling like he deserved to be here in Formula 1. And in 1996, he sought some advice, he did things very differently, and of course he became world champion. And one of the main things that he learned in that season was not worrying about things he couldn't control. Sounds very simple, sounds very easy, but you know what? Mental illnesses and mental health requirements, sometimes you just hear things and you think, oh yeah, whatever, you know, that sounds quite cliche and everything else. But sometimes if you take actually heed of what's being said, there'll be so much change that can happen. Bear in mind, Damon Hill was seeking like this sort of advice back in the 90s, in the mid-90s. That was never a thing. Mental health, mental illness, that was never a thing. The seventh thing that we learned in this episode, and this was really quite touching, the weekend in which Ayrton Senna had passed away. Ayrton Senna was the teammate of Damon Hill in 1994. Senna spoke to Damon Hill's wife, Georgie, to try and assure her that, you know what, Damon's going to be fine in Formula 1. He's going to be absolutely okay. He's a nice guy. He's very clever. He's very intelligent. And he said that he will be all right. He's a good driver. And he's also in a good team. And this was literally the weekend, both where and when he passed away. Damon hears this afterwards, you know, and he says, you know, he didn't have to do that. You know, it was such a nice gesture that he didn't really have to do that. He didn't really get to know Senna that long because, of course, it was quite a short stint before he unfortunately passed away. How did Damon manage to get back on the circuit after, you know, Ayrton Senna had passed away? Obviously, they stopped the race and they stopped everything there, but then, you know, they went back out and continued again. And then Damon Hill brings up this point about, you know, the night before we'd lost Roland. That's right, Roland Ratzenberger had passed away in qualifying the day before, and all the drivers, you know, the next day got into the race, and that kicked things off. And then unfortunately, of course, the crash then happened to Ayrton Senna. And, you know, this is what we would call a horror weekend in Formula One, you know, in Imola in '94. But Damon was like, you know what, remember Senna jumped in the car straight after hearing about Roland's death, and yet all of us just jumped in. Like, at the end of the day, things do happen in this sport, and you have to learn how to just park the emotions to get back on the matter at hand. And he concluded that, look, these men, as you can see, loved to race. That's how everybody got over the situation. They were race drivers. Senna, race driver. Roland, race driver. So too is Damon Hill. These were all people who are on a different level, who are, you know, the elite of the elite, especially in a sport like this. And, you know, nothing was going to stop them from wanting to race again. You think now of recent times, we've had Jules Bianchi, you know, pass away, unfortunately. We've even had Romain Grosjean nearly, like, you know, burned alive. And yet drivers still got back out there, still carried on. And even to this day, we don't even really talk about it anymore. It's incredible how quick human beings can move on. Number 8, we learned about, of course, the rivalry with Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill. And look, in the time, in that moment, people you either loved or hated Michael Schumacher. You loved one or you loved the other. It all depended on what was the circumstance at the time. If he was German, you probably loved Schumacher more. If he was a Benetton fan, and so on and so forth. But Damon Hill concludes and says, look, Schumacher took me to strengths and places that I never thought I could do on my own. He says, without the pressure that Michael Schumacher put on him, without the mind games, the manipulation, and just the tactical ways of trying to win, he doesn't think he would probably even become a world champion. Hill had to dig deep and go to a different place in order to compete with such a monster, and I mean that in a good way, like Michael Schumacher. Damon Hill uses words like he extended himself, he went beyond himself, and that was the way he could compete with somebody like Michael and, you know, win a world championship. It's like that scripture in the Bible where Jacob wrestles with God and wins. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre choice of words. Here's the 9th thing that I learnt on this episode, and this is quite interesting. He says 1995 was a real crisis year for him. He said he had to sort out his head. Look, Michael Schumacher was dealing with this man in 1995. They were so close in 1994. It was a great title race. A title race that was quite shocking for Damon Hill because people didn't expect him to be in that situation. But in 95, I'm sure Damon thought, you know, after I've battled with Michael and I should have probably won the title that year, he thought, you know, another year now, let's have a good go at it. Maybe I can challenge him. Maybe I can beat him. The expectations were there. The British fan base was behind Damon Hill. But the mind games of Michael Schumacher, honestly, like, he absolutely destroyed Damon Hill mentally. And Damon goes on to say, like, look, Michael sucked me in. Like, the things that he would do, I would fall for them. And when he was asked, like, what kind of mind games, what did he do that kind of got you lured in? And he goes, he remembers this one time he won a race and he was doing the press conference, and I think obviously Michael was on the podium as well, probably finished second. And as he was speaking, you know, Michael then starts having a conversation with somebody else. And I must admit, in Formula One press conferences, I see this happen all the time. It really annoys me. But you imagine the interviewer is asking Damon Hill a question. Then in the background, you can see Michael's talking to, I don't know, Heitzhauer Frentzen, I don't know, anyone random. But that used to pee off Damon Hill as well. He says it irritated him for sure. And Damon Hill also goes on to say, like, look, his weakness, his number one weakness is if you do not show humanity towards him, he loses it. You know, this is the sort of stuff that gets to him. And then he said, look, in 1995, I was beaten physically and I was beaten mentally. And things had to change in 1996. If you're loving Formula One content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Smash a like on the video as well if you're loving talk about Damon Hill and if you love Formula One talk in general. Thank you for making it to the 10th and final one. Check this, right? And this is a man who is winning the title race in 1996. Williams always gave Damon Hill a 1-year rolling contract, and in 1996, Williams had already acquired 2 drivers ready for 1997. Bear in mind that Damon Hill was leading the championship, and it was at the German Grand Prix in Hockenheim in 1996 where Williams had already signed 2 new drivers. That was in Jacques Villeneuve and Heitzhauer Frentzen, and then in Monza the same season, it all came out. And Damon says, look, he took it well. Damon kind of gives his character, you know, he gives this opinion of himself of basically somebody who doesn't necessarily, like, I'm not going to get all angry and mad about stuff. I'm just going to be like, okay, cool, take it on my stride and move on. He was a very kind of solace kind of human being. He's somebody who would take the information on. And maybe looking back at it now, he might have acted a bit differently. But the way he grew up, the way he said that his family grew him up, his parents grew him up, was not somebody who would complain, don't complain, you know, make sort of solutions, find solutions in ways and not to complain about things and so everything's everybody else's fault except his own. He was very much like that. And even in 96, where he's being world champion and yet he's being kicked out of the team, it was bizarre. Don't get me wrong, Jacques Villeneuve went and won the championship in 1997 with the Williams. It's peak. But he said he took it well, but if there's a thing that he did mention, he said, listen, if I'm going to lose this seat, that's fine. I'm taking this championship with me. And the thing that kind of gave him confidence and gave him satisfaction, let's say, is that I am leaving this team with the world championship. And that's an incredible line, an incredible way to wrap up that interview. The interview was really, really brilliant. Shout out to Jake Humphries. I forget the other presenter's name. I should know better. But it's a great podcast. It's a great show. Shout out to Jake Humphries. And shout out to Damon Hughes as well, who gave great input, great insight, asked brilliant questions as well to Damon. And Damon Hill for the fantastic answers that he gave. He gave us a lot of insight into who the character was. It was great to see the personality of Damon Hill. Over the years, I've kind of heard things about him and I've never really had to get a real sense of who he is. Obviously, I've just seen him in, being presenters for Sky Sports and things like that. Now he's off there. And people kind of had this way about him. People had opinions about him. But watching this interview, I got a really clear perspective of who this kind of person was. And it was brilliant for us to see. But those are the 10 things that I learned from the High Performance Podcast with Damon Hill. Let me know in the comment section if you liked this interview as well, and what was your favorite moment? What did you enjoy most about that podcast? And what was the number one thing that you learned? YouTube thinks you'll like this video over here, talking all things Formula One, of course, or you can check my latest video right over here. Until next time, lights out.
This is something that many people didn't think could possibly happen today. They thought Damon would drive a cautious race, but he fought. He fought from second on the grid. He passed Jacques Villeneuve. He took the lead. He stayed there. And Damon Hill exits the chicane and wins the Japanese Grand Prix. And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.